All right, welcome everybody to the practical introduction to Prisma workshop. I'm going to start sharing my screen and share the most important information about this workshop with you so that you all know what you have gotten yourself into. So this is really a beginner-friendly workshop today that has basically no prerequisites. So in order to successfully complete the tasks in the workshop, you just need Node.js installed on your machine, and it's recommended but not required to use VS Code, just because there is a Prisma VS Code extension that makes the experience a lot smoother. And the TypeScript integration with VS Code is also really, really good. But you don't have to use it if you have your own favorite text editor that you want to use today. That is, of course, totally fine too. Then I have this link here that I'm quickly going to drop in the chat. Let me quickly find the chat again. This is the Notion page that I'm looking at right now. You can all open it. That has all the information for the workshop that we are going to do today. What you'll do today, so this is really a very beginner-friendly workshop. I'll show you everything that you have to do first, and then you can redo that yourself to get some hands-on experience. So in this workshop, you'll learn about various workflows that are useful to know when using Prisma, and especially when you're just getting started with Prisma. So at first, you'll start by setting up Prisma with a SQLite database. You learn about data modeling with Prisma and how to perform a database migration. That's all in lesson 1. Then in lesson 2, we'll start covering Prisma Client, which is a type-safe query builder that can be used to query a database. And you're going to just explore various queries from plain CRUD to relation queries to filters and pagination. People in the chat say that they don't see the link. Should I drop it again? All right, can other people see it? I think I dropped it. Can you not? Okay, that's weird. Panelists and attendees I have to select here in the chat. No, it should be there for everybody to see. All right, seems like you got it. All right, and once you have a good feeling for how to query your database with Prisma Client, you will apply that knowledge by implementing the routes of a REST API that I have prepared for you. And then to make things complete, you'll do the same, but just with a GraphQL API. So for those of you who already have some experience with either REST or GraphQL, hopefully this will complement your knowledge nicely in terms of how to work with a database with these two technologies. The agenda for today looks as follows. So we are already in the kickoff. Then the first lesson is just the setup, the data modeling, and the first migration. I'm roughly planning 20 minutes for that. Then the next one for Prisma client queries maybe is a little bit longer. I plan that for 40 minutes. And then the two last ones, each 30 minutes. But we'll see, maybe we're a little bit faster and actually can wrap up earlier, or maybe, I don't think so, but maybe we'll go a little bit over time depending on how you all keep up with the tasks. So here are all the lessons that I'm going to show you in detail in a little bit. But first, I want to quickly tell you what a lesson actually looks like. So every lesson is structured in 2 parts. And the first part, that's the host walkthrough. That's where I'm going to show you all the tasks. And during that phase, I highly recommend to you to not yet get started on the task yourself, but rather really try to observe what I'm doing, try to understand what I'm doing, potentially raise any questions that you might have. In Zoom, you should be able to use the Q&A section for that. So if you have questions, then don't drop them in the chat, rather use the Q&A section. And I already see that there is an issue with the link that I dropped, that it sends people to the last year's workshop. I don't know why that happened before. It didn't. That's so weird. Okay, then you know what? I'll just ditch the Prisma link and just share the more ugly link of the Notion document. Doesn't matter either way, I guess. So with this one, you should have the correct the correct link to the correct Notion doc that I'm showing right now. The last one was from the Prisma Day workshop that I gave last year. It's very similar, but since then a couple of things happened, evolved in the Prisma ecosystem. So this workshop is just up to date and is a little bit more expensive even with these tasks about building REST API and GraphQL APIs. A very quick note about myself. So I'm Nicholas. I really am enjoying anything that relates to developer education, be it learning new things myself or teaching things to other developers. And I've been with Prisma for almost 4.5 years now. Back in the time, we were still called GraphQL. We were building a GraphQL backend as a service, and now we kind of pivoted to this Node and TypeScript ORM that we are going to explore today. This is where you can find me on social media or reach out to me on the Prisma Slack or via email. A couple of logistics about the webinar itself on Zoom. So if you have any questions, then please use the Q&A section in Zoom. That's much easier to see for me compared to the chat, where all the messages are going to disappear when a lot of people write into it. And I probably won't have an eye on the chat during the entire time. But I'll try to occasionally check in. So if I mess up anything, if for some reason screen share is breaking down or so, then just write a big capital letters into the chat, and then at some point I'll notice, or put the alarm emoji, whatever you then can think of. Can you say something during the workshop so that all attendees can hear it? By default, no, but I think if you want, I could promote you on the stage. So if that comes up, you can maybe chat or like send me a message in the chat in private. There's also a feature in Zoom that allows you to raise your hand. Actually, let's quickly try that. Do you all see the raise your hand feature? Yes, I see a lot of notifications coming in here that folks are raising their hand. So that feature is working. I might be using that later for some quick polls that I can do. We have a code of conduct. We really want to make sure that everybody has a safe experience here. And if you want to host this workshop yourself, which you can do, you can just reuse all the resources that are being used today. So you can use this Notion document, you can modify it. There's also an associated GitHub repository that you can use. And if you want to do that and you have questions, how to get started, how to reach an audience, all of that, then you can always reach out to me and I'd be happy to give you some advice and share some insights how to best do that. And of course, it seems like you're all or mostly Prisma newcomers. And if you're not aware, we have a gigantic Slack community that by now has over 40,000 developers. And it's very lively. People ask questions, help each other. So I would encourage you, if you want to become a part of the Prisma community, to then join us there. I think I skipped that the workshop is being recorded. So that's already happening. I'm recording and everything is going to be available on the Prisma YouTube channel that you should check out, by the way. For example, my colleague Ryan Chenke and I, we're doing these bi-weekly live streams, What's New in Prisma, where we're discussing the latest features of the most recent release and in general, news of the Prisma ecosystem and community. With all that being said, let's get into the workshop and into the first lesson that's just about setting up Prisma and getting comfortable with Prisma's data modeling language and performing your first database migration. So I have prepared this starter project from GitHub. And again, as a reminder, for now, it's probably best if you just watch me as I do all of this. And then later on, you can you get time to actually do this yourself. So I'm opening the GitHub repo. And there are some setup instructions right here that I'm going to just follow. So here's my terminal. And please also let me know, I have an eye on the chat, if I need to increase font size or anything like that. So for now, I'm just going ahead and cloning the repo and navigating into the directory and already installing my dependencies and opening it up in VS Code right here. So let's take a very quick look around in the project. Regarding dependencies, we only have very few. So basically, we're configuring a very basic TypeScript project that has TS Node and the TypeScript dependencies. It has the Prisma CLI as a development dependency as well, and already the Prisma client dependency that we'll be using to query the database. And then it has a script, an empty one. It only has an async main function that we'll use to later write our database queries in the first 2 lessons. And then we have this Prisma schema file right here that at the moment looks pretty empty. We only have this data source that is telling Prisma where the database that we want to use is located. And in this case, for this particular workshop, we're going to use SQLite, because that's easier to set up. It doesn't require you to set up a Postgres server, a MySQL server, anything like that. It'll be located in a database file. So that's the convenient part about SQLite. It's really just a file on the file system. It's not an additional database server that needs to run. And that's going to be in the same directory, in the Prisma directory. It's called devdb is the name of the file. And then we specify the Prisma client generator, which means that we later on want to use Prisma client. All right, so let's take a look at the first tasks. So here, this entire like Notion document and the setup of these tasks, by the way, it's really kind of set up as a tutorial that you could even follow by yourself if it wasn't me who would showing you everything right now. But you can now kind of just watch me as I'm going through these tasks first and raise your questions if you have any. And there is explanation. And then there is the tasks that you're actually going to do. And in this case, I want to start by creating a user model with the following fields: an ID, a name, and an email. So that's going to be super basic. And the Prisma modeling language you'll see is super intuitive to use. If you've worked with GraphQL, for example, in the past, and you're familiar with the GraphQL schema language, then it'll also be very familiar. It'll feel very familiar because it was inspired actually by GraphQL SDL, and we really liked how easy it was for developers to model their data with it. So we took a lot of inspiration from that. So I create a new model with a model keyword right here. The Prisma VX code extension is already complaining because every model that I declare with Prisma must have a unique field. And in this case, that's going to be an auto-incrementing integer that's going to be also the primary key of my user model. This is kind of the basic requirement for every model, to have at least one field that's marked either with the ID attribute or a unique attribute. And the reason, by the way, why I'm modeling my data here is twofold. One, this is going to reflect my database schema. So every model later on is going to map to a database table. And it also serves as the foundation for the Prisma client API that's used to query the database later on. So I need to add 2 more fields to this model, a name field and an email field. The name field should be optional, and the email field should be required and unique. And the way how we add these additional qualifiers is via Prisma attributes. So first, I'm adding a name field that should be of type string. By default, all fields on models are required, but I want to make this one optional, so I'm adding the question mark right after it. And then I have the email field. That's a string. And I want this to be unique and required, so it won't get a question mark. And then a quick note about the Prisma VS Code extension, that if you install it, it'll actually help you format your Prisma schema and align the fields, the types, and the attributes in a columnar style, which is very nice. For each task inside this Notion document, you always have the solution that you can expand if you don't know how to continue. And otherwise, you can just try to find the solution by yourself, either by still remembering it from what I've shown you or by scanning the Prisma documentation that you can find at prisma.io/docs. All right. Once you have this model in place, you want to go ahead and actually create the database. So right now, we really don't have a database yet. All we have is this Prisma schema, which is just a file on my file system. And in order to create a database and create the user table that represents this model, I have to run a migration command of the Prisma CLI. And in this case, the command is called Prisma migrate dev. So Prisma migrate has workflows for different kinds of development stages. And since we are just kind of in an early development stage at this point, we just use the migrate dev command for this. And when I run this command, it's going ahead and creating two new things for me. You can ignore this journal file right here. But the two relevant parts are a migrations directory and the devdb database file that I had mentioned before. So let's very quickly take a look at the migrations directory that was created. You can actually see the SQL that has been executed against the database file right here. Of course, I can't watch that because it's a binary file. It's just the database, the SQLite database file. So I can't really open it in VS Code. But at this point, what you can do is you can open the database in Prisma Studio with the Prisma Studio command. And in fact, that's already the second task of this lesson, is to create 3 records in the user table and save them in the database. And I'm going to do that just with Prisma Studio right here. So I'm going to enter the names of 3 colleagues of mine and 3 email addresses. So one is Nilu, one is Mahmoud, and one is Itel. So these are 3 of my colleagues. They all work at Prisma, and I'm adding these 3 records to the database, and that's it already. I have the first 3 database records in my local SQLite database file. That's it from my side for the first lesson. So now you get 5 to 10 minutes to go through these tasks yourself, go through the setup, create your first data model, and run your first migration. And maybe once you're done with this, drop a quick comment in the chat so that I know that you're ready and I have a little bit of a feeling for how many people are done with their task already. In the meantime, I'm quickly going to mute myself and turn off my video just so that you have some distraction-free time. All right, here I am again. I see that a couple of people already are done with the task, but don't worry, you still have a bit of time. I just quickly wanted to pick up some questions that have been asked in the Q&A section. So the first one was a question about the VS Code extension. I also just shared the link to that in the Q&A section itself, so you can pick it up from there. And another question is, what types are allowed in the models? And that's a really good question, actually. I alluded to that very quickly, just to the portion of whether types can be required or optional, so that you can indicate with the question mark operator. But of course, you could also use arrays or even more specific database types. You can actually check all the available types here in the documentation as well. Actually, for SQLite, we don't have any further more specific native type mappings. But if you're using Postgres or MySQL, then you can use all of the Postgres or most of the actual Postgres data types that you can use in native Postgres as well. And there are some types that are not yet supported natively in the Prisma schema, but you can still use them. And the way how you would then use them is by actually modifying the generated SQL files right here and just use the data types that you want inside the migration file. So I didn't mention this, but this SQL migration file it's auto-generated, but on the other hand, it's also fully customizable. So if you, for some reason, want to do like something else in this SQL file, or maybe you just want to insert some additional data, you want to set up a trigger or something like this, operations that are not natively supported in the Prisma schema, you can do that by just manually editing the SQL right here. There's another question about a plugin for IntelliJ. And as far as I know, there is a community plugin, but we don't have an official plugin for it yet. And I don't think we're working on one. But you can find more info about this in the editor setup page in the docs here. I'm going to link that as an answer to this question. All right, we have 10 people roughly that are done with it. Let's wait 2 or 3 more minutes until we move on to the next task. I'm going to leave Prisma Studio open. I'm going to leave the docs open. There is a question about the recommended node versions. That should also be covered in the documentation in the reference here. So we have the system requirements, and yeah, Christian is saying that they're using Prisma Studio with Node 16 and that it doesn't work, but with Node 14 it works. That corresponds with the system requirements here. I'm actually not super sure if 16 is already supported. You might want to open an issue on GitHub though that Node 16 is not working for you. That's also general advice that we are super active on GitHub. Our product and engineering teams are monitoring our GitHub issues, triaging them, prioritizing them. Typically, when you create an issue, you hear back within the first 24 hours after you created it. So it's super important for us to always be kind of up to date and know about the issues that you're running into. So really never, ever hesitate to open up a GitHub issue. Worst thing is that one of our engineers pops in and tells you what you did wrong and solves your problem like this, and it wasn't even a Prisma problem. So I think that's a good idea in either way. And there already is a GitHub issue for Node 16 even. So leave your thumbs up on that issue, or leave a comment if you desperately want to use it to indicate to our product team that you really want to use it. Oh, actually, this has been solved, but will only be released, I guess, with 2.22, and right now we're using 2.21. And that should suffice as an answer for this one. And the next question is, should one worry about SQL written in the migrations? Are they optimized for performance? That's an interesting question. Actually, I think for the migrations, performance is, I think, less of a concern because it typically doesn't happen at runtime, and it's kind of a one-off operation. So I've never heard anyone actually complain about performance of the generated SQL migrations. But performance is definitely a topic for generated SQL when you're querying the database, right? So in a bit, you'll see that you're using Prisma Client with a very nice JavaScript, TypeScript API that feels very familiar. But under the hood, of course, we are generating SQL. And there is always a question whether that's the most optimal SQL that could be generated. And I think what's important to realize is that there is a difference between kind of perceived performance problems and actual performance problems. And as far as I'm concerned, I have talked to very, very few users that ran into actual performance problems with Prisma Client so far. And in fact, if that happens, we always encourage you to create the GitHub issue so that we can reproduce it, because we are very, very eager to make Prisma the fastest ORM in the JavaScript and TypeScript ecosystem. So if you ever find that a query should be more optimized than what you're finding, then please talk to us because we have a vested interest into that. There is one last question that I'm taking before moving on, or actually, let's move on to the next lesson already. I'll save the next question for the next break when you're working on the next lesson. So moving along to lesson 2. Goal of this lesson is to get comfortable with the Prisma Client API and explore some of the available database queries that you can send with it. Along the way, you will run another migration to introduce a second model with a relation to the user model that you created before. And for the setup in this lesson, you can just continue working on the same project. I already showed you that we have this script file with a main function, and this is where we're going to write our Prisma Client queries one by one for each task. A couple of hints for you to get the most out of this. So actually, let me reorder the hints here. I think it's always super important when you're just learning something that even if you don't know the solution and you need to take a peek at the solution by expanding the collapsible element here, it's still important to just type things yourself and not copy paste the solution. That will just make things stick a lot more in your brain. And I think that's always a good way to learn in general. Also, when you're typing yourself, you're going to get the pleasure of experiencing Prisma's auto-completion. So this is actually one of the main kind of bonus points, I think, that repeatedly gets called out about Prisma Client, that because of its auto-completion, you don't have to look up the reference documentation all the time, but you can just basically explore the API at your fingertips, which is really nice. And then, of course, we have Prisma Studio that you can use to always validate whether your tasks are actually correct, whether they provided the correct result. So I'm going to start going through a couple of these tasks here and showing you what you have to do. And by the way, this script here that I have, you can execute it with the npm run dev command. That is just executing the dev script right here. Pretty straightforward. And right now, nothing is really happening in the script. We're just invoking an empty main function. Pretty boring. So let's make that a little bit more fun by looking at the first task. The first task is that we want to write a query to return all user records and printing them with console log. So I'm going to do that and store, actually just calling this generically results so I can reuse this later on. The way how you can just write queries with Prisma Client is you use this Prisma Client instance that I created right here. And from then on, you can basically have yourself led by the auto-completion. So in this case, I want to query all user records. So prisma.user seems like a reasonable thing to start with. And actually now I can see all the different operations that I have available on Prisma Client for the user model. And in this case, find many is the appropriate query that I want to use, and log the results to the console if I can type at the end of this long day. All right, so that should be it already. When I now run npm run dev, we are querying exactly the 3 users that I just created via Prisma Studio in the previous lesson. All right, let's move on to the next task. Write a query to create a new user record. I am supposed to create a new user record that has only an email, but not a name. So again, let me go ahead and use the auto-completion here. There is a create function that I can invoke, and I'm just using auto-completion that I'm invoking with control space. There is this data argument that allows me to provide arguments to the query, and in this case I just want to create a new database record for this user that has been provided here. So again, just invoking the script, running npm run dev, we have created this new database record. And to validate that, I can go back to Prisma Studio, refresh the page, and indeed we see that there is a new database record with the email address that I just provided. So we can already move on to the next one. This is going to be really quick. Write a query to update an existing user record. So now we are taking the same user record that we just created, and we want to create the name now. So just adding it a little bit later. Let me again remove the part here and see which method is appropriate. Update in this case. And what arguments does update take? So one important argument is the where object that's used to identify the user record that I want to update. And here I have 2 choices because a user has 2 unique fields, either email or ID. And now I can pick which one I want to use in this case. In this case, I'm going to just use the email because I have it fresh in my memory what that was, but I could also provide the ID for if I wanted to go for the ID. So that's one part of my update query. The second part is the actual data that I want to update. And this, here I can provide values for the different fields of a user. And in this case, I want to update the name to the value Alice. And that's it. I'm running npm run dev. The record seems to have gotten updated, and I can validate that in Prisma Studio, and that's correct as well. Oh, task 3 again. Well, you see that I can't count. I'll just leave it here because otherwise I have to increment all the other tasks as well. Okay, so this was already somewhat interesting. We were operating on a single table in the database, but let's make this even more interesting by introducing a relation into our data model and adding a second model to it. So I'm opening the Prisma schema file again. And I'm just, to have the scaffold of my new model, I'm just copy pasting the one from before. And now I'm adding the fields that are described here. So first we need a title. Again, that's going to be a string and it's required. So I don't add the question mark here. Content, that's the actual content of a post. This is going to be optional. Then we have a field that's called published that indicates whether a post is published or not. So it's kind of 2 states. I'll use a Boolean for that. And the default value for that should be false, so that every post that we create in the database by default is not published. And now comes the interesting part, I think, and that's how we configure the relationship to the user. And the first thing to kind of note about this is that while in the Prisma client API, you will be able to traverse the relation in a very intuitive way. When you model the relation, you still have to create what's called a foreign key when you're modeling data with SQL. And the foreign key is a value. In this case, it's an integer because it refers to the ID of the user model. The relation is supposed to be optional, so I'm adding the question mark here. And the way how you then add that in Prisma is by using the relation attribute, but actually it's not the actual relation field, because this is now the part that's different from modeling with SQL, that when you're using Prisma to model your relations, you have these relation fields. And these will be exposed later on in the Prisma client API for you to perform operations like traversing the relation or performing things like a nested write, where you can create a model, a user and a post at the same time. There are two arguments in the relation attribute. One is called fields, and that's just the field from this model, and then the field that it references. And that's actually the other way around. This is the author ID that's from this model, and it references the ID field on the user model. What did I mess up? The relation is missing an opposite relation field. Yes. One important thing about modeling relations with Prisma is that all relations have to be bidirectional. That means I need to have an opposite relation field on the other side of the relation, in this case on the user model. And here I'm using the square bracket notation to indicate that this is an array of posts that a user can have. But that is it for modeling the requirements that have been described here. So we still remember how to run a migration. In this case, I'm going to name it add post. And that's creating, again, a new migration on the file system. We can see what actually happened. So in fact, it just created this new table and created this foreign key column here on author ID. One thing to note is that the relation fields right here, they are purely virtual. They don't exist in the database. They are something that Prisma adds on top of that to make it easier for you to work with relations later on in your code. Okay, with the new model in place, in fact, we can already start querying the new model. And in this case, we're tasked to create a new post record. And I'm just going to use the same approach again. I already see that the auto completion here shows me the post. And I remember from before that there is this create method, the data, and in this case, I can create a new post just by providing a title, because that's the only value that needs to be provided, that's required, and that doesn't have a default value. So I can create a new post just like that. Running npm run dev enables me to create this new post, and after restarting Prisma Studio, so Prisma Studio is not yet smart enough to pick up migration changes, not yet, that's in the works. But if you restart the Prisma Studio server, you'll see the post right here, and also the post that I just created via the script. All right, I'm going to show a couple of more queries, and then you get your time to work on these tasks yourself. So the next one is a query to connect a user and a post record. So if you notice that the post record that we just created it has no author yet. It's just a post record that exists in the void that hasn't been authored by anyone, but we want to change that through code with a Prisma client query. And the way how we can do that is by using the update query again. And there are actually two ways how I could do this. So either I could just go and directly set the author ID like this. And before I actually do that, let me quickly just make sure that I'm identifying the post correctly. So it's post with ID number 1. And what I want to change is I could now directly specify the author ID, but in here it says that I should connect it via the email field. So I'm going to use the slightly more verbose API that allows me to connect an existing post with a user by their email value. And I'm going to connect it with the one that I created last. That was Alice, yes, just to make sure. All right, let's run this. We can now see that the author ID has been set. And if we go back to Prisma Studio, this is now set. Here we can also track the relation directly in the Prisma Studio UI. And here I believe that because this was still open, I actually have to show this. And we can see that there is one post here on the Alice database record. All right, a couple of more tasks that I'm going to show you here. Write a query to retrieve a single user record by a unique value. So again, this time I'm going to use the autocompletion to find unique query that feels appropriate for this task. A user, so I have to change this here. And I can retrieve any user in this case. So I'm just going to retrieve user 1. All right, that worked. Let's see. Now it's getting starting to get interesting. I think I'm going to show 2 more queries, and after that I'll give you the time to work on that yourself. Write a query that selects only a subset of fields. So for this task, you can reuse the same find many query for users that you used in task 1. However, this time your goal is to only select a subset of the fields of the user model. Specifically, all returned objects should only contain the ID and name, but not the email field. So let me first go back to task 1. This time I'm going to be lazy and just copy paste the solution. So how do I select subfields in a query? Using the auto-completion and seeing if anything looks good for me to use here. And indeed, there is an option that I can provide that's called select. So again, let's just follow the auto-completion and see what happens. Well, it now shows me all the fields of the user model that are available, and I want to use ID and name, and it takes a Boolean. So the notation for this is just ID true and name true. And I can run this, and this time we'll get objects back that only have these 2 properties. So just as a reminder, if I remove this, run the script, we'll get the full objects with the email field. If I select specifically only ID and name, then we only have these 2 fields. And the cool thing about this is not even only the way how you can select this here, but if you look at the type of the results. So in fact, let me just grab one user from the result. It's actually statically typed. So I can only access ID and name here. I don't even have the option to access email. And that's really, really unique in the TypeScript ecosystem. If you're looking at other ORMs like TypeORM, for example, you always have the option to also access the properties that you didn't retrieve just because TypeScript is not aware at compile time which types you're using or like which fields you're actually selecting. So that's very unique, and it gives you a level of type safety that you really don't get with any other ORM library. And the next one is a relation query to include a relation in the result. So take your query from task 6 and include the relation to the user table. So I'm going to do that. This was a query for querying the user Alice. Just as a reminder, this is what it returns. And I am now supposed to include the relation to the user table. Well, I guess to the post table in this case. Changing workshop materials on the fly. So let's see how we can achieve that. I'm again using the auto completion, and you'll notice that I have the select and include. So with almost any Prisma client query, I believe, be it create, update, find one, or like find unique, find many, find first, with all of these, you can always use select and include to specify what exactly should be returned. If you don't provide either of these, Prisma Client will just return all scalar fields of the model. If you use select, then it will only return the ones that you specifically included in the select option. And if you use include, it means that it will include all the, or it will return all the scalar fields plus the relation that you specify via include. So include is specifically for relations of a model. This is the notation that I have to use, npm run dev. And we see that it's actually printing this now. And again, I believe this is explained here. Again, what's really cool is that, not the pagination query. Okay, I really messed up the task numbering here. Notice that the result of your query is again fully typed, and the type is generated on the fly. So this result thing here, it is actually typed to user with an array of posts. So again, I have the same situation that if I take the user or just like any user from the result, I can, because it's only a single user this time. Result.posts, and here I can now go ahead and access all the properties of the posts. So the type safety here is really, really helpful with everything that you have to do. There are a couple of more queries, nested write, a filter, and a pagination query. I'll leave these up to you to explore, and withdraw myself from the screen for 5 minutes to give you, again, a distraction-free time to work on these tasks. And after that, I'll pick up the questions from the Q&A. So don't hesitate to put more questions into that. All right, I'm muting myself. Don't worry, you still have a couple of minutes, but I wanted to react to a couple of questions. And by the way, feel free to drop in the chat when you're done so that I have a bit of a feeling who is done. We have 30 people who are here. I don't know if everybody is actually doing the hands-on part or if people are just hanging out and watching. But just drop in the chat so that I have an indication how many of you are done and whether we can move on. So a couple of questions have been asked. Let me first take this one. If we have many models created, can we have them in other folders or import? So the way how I understand this question is whether you can split the Prisma schema file into multiple files. And this is currently not possible. So at the moment, the way how you have to do it is that you have a single schema.prisma file that's kind of the center of your entire Prisma setup. As far as I'm aware, there are community solutions for that. So you're not the only person that wants this. And although this has not been high priority for us, there are people that care about this and that implemented their own kind of solution for that. I think there might be a GitHub issue. Support for splitting Prisma schema into multiple files. If we're lucky, people even posted their own solutions here. I don't know. Workarounds, Prisma merge schema. So that might be interesting for you, but this is a request that we get quite often. So in fact, Matt, one of the product manager for Prisma Client, has written quite an extensive update 2 weeks ago. So just go into that issue and leave a comment, leave a thumbs up with your use case. Question from Carlos Delgado. The update method returns the new object or the object before it was updated? It returns the updated object. I think we saw that when I updated Alice to have a name, that when I ran the code, actually it came back with the name already set. Next question, can we rename or use an alias like phone number to phone number in uppercase letters? So is it possible, the way how I understand this question is that this person is asking whether we can have a different field name or like column name in the database for a Prisma field. And the answer to that is yes. And the way how that works is that we can use the map attribute for that. And if I wanted to spell content here in uppercase letters, I could go ahead and do this. Now, I'm not actually going to execute this migration to not mess with my actual database schema. I'm appending the create only option, which means that with this one, it'll only generate the SQL file, but not execute it. And I assume that this is going to, yeah. So it's basically like recreating the post table, and it's making sure that content is spelled all uppercase. But I won't execute that now, as I mentioned. Just deleting that. So that's possible. You can have a different column name in the database than the field name of your Prisma model. Another question. I see that Prisma Client doesn't allow you to specify select fields when using the include property to fetch a relation. Is there a way to bypass that? And might be missing something here, so pardon me if that's the case. That's a very good question and a very good observation indeed. When I now try to do this, I'm getting an error, a TypeScript error. The TypeScript compiler is mad at me because that's not allowed. That's actually also described in our docs. In fact, when you have this use case, the way how to deal with this is to not use include actually, but instead just use select, because select also allows you to select relations. So you can do this and you're good. So in that case, you just wouldn't use include. Hope that answers the question. How come Prisma decided to come up with a schema file format versus modeling the data versus modeling the data in JavaScript and TypeScript? I think there are a couple of reasons to that. And it's actually super interesting because a lot of people I'm talking to, especially like Prisma newcomers, people that kind of are curious about Prisma, that initially are kind of repelled by the fact that they have to learn a new language. But maybe you, now having used this a little bit already, you can confirm this already. It probably didn't take that much time for you to pick this up and actually learn. So I would claim that the learning curve here is actually not that steep, and you can you can understand what's going on here fairly quickly. One reason why we introduced this extra schema layer is just to have a modeling language that is a bit more human readable, and a schema that everybody can basically understand, even people that are not familiar with JavaScript and TypeScript. And by the way, we're also bringing Prisma Client to other languages. So we even already have a second generator that's called Prisma Client Go that gives you Prisma Client for Go. And to have kind of a universal way to model your data, we decided to use this extra modeling language. And so far, people really seem to like it. So that's typically one of the highlights that people share when they're talking about their experience with Prisma. Question from Joey. I always wanted to ask about how Prisma manages connections and resources. I've seen some warning saying Prisma is running when you forget to disconnect. This is probably a little bit too in depth to explain here on this stream. The best I can do, I think, is just forward you to the documentation on that about connection management, where we are explaining all of that. In case you have seen this already and it doesn't explain the question that you have enough, then please create a new issue in the docs repo right here. And just tell us that the docs here are not clear, you still have this question, you don't know where to find it, and we'll try to improve the documentation so that next time you actually find that information. Is it possible to rename fields in the database using Prisma migrations? That should be possible. I think that's also documented in the workflows. I don't know the workflow off the top of my head, and if you actually need to go through the path that I showed just a couple of minutes ago with the create only option, or if there is a dedicated path to do this. Actually, like these kinds of situations for me are also always nice to kind of just like validate our documentation and put me into the shoes of you as a user by using our docs in the same way how you would use them. And indeed, when I just type renaming into the search bar, we get this part in the docs. So I think here we have a good explanation of how you would go about renaming a column in the database. All right, all the questions answered. That's a really good feeling. And I think you all had enough time now to work on these queries. If you didn't manage to do all of them, don't worry, you can, if you're really eager, of course, you can continue with these lessons after the webinar has finished as well. Okay, next lesson. Where is the Notion document? Here. Let's go back to the home page of the Notion document and move on to the next lesson. That's about a REST API. So the goal of this lesson is to use your freshly gained knowledge about Prisma Client and use it to implement some routes of a REST API that's written with Express. Maybe let's quickly use the show hand functionality here. Who of you has worked on a REST API with Express at some point in the past? Not necessarily like production grade, but just maybe you did a tutorial or a side project. So a couple of people raising their hand. I see 5 hands, 6, 7. So Express 8, 9. Express seems to be familiar. It's kind of the most popular library, I would say, in the Node.js ecosystem for building web APIs. Like you can even use it to build a GraphQL API as well. So yeah, I wouldn't call it just for REST APIs, really for any kind of HTTP API, basically. All right, for the setup, there is a different setup for this one. I'm going to close all the open files. I'm going to stash the current state of the project, and then I'm going to switch the branch to the REST API branch. And I'm going to just reset basically my entire project by removing the migration history, by removing the database file. And here is what we are left with. So, and even the node modules, I also want to reset just so that we have a very fresh start. So let's take a look and start by exploring package.json. It's again a very similar setup to what we had before. So TypeScript, Prisma and Prisma client, this all looks familiar. We know it from the previous lesson. Additionally, we now have Express as a dependency. We have some additional types that are handy now. And that's it already. So again, just a very bare bones kind of project that we're using here. Regarding the Prisma schema that we're using for this one, it also looks very, very similar to what you just created yourself. There are just a couple of new fields on the post model just to show you a little bit more the available features with Prisma. So we have a created at and an updated at field that will be automatically populated. You don't have to provide these when you create new post records. And a view count field that's an integer that also gets a default value. So these are the new fields on the post model, and the rest is just exactly the same that you knew from before. But because we don't have a database, we don't have migrations, I just deleted all of that. I have to run the migration command again to create the database. There you go. We have our database. We have 2 tables. And this time there is the seeding feature that we're going to use. Somebody raised that in the Q&A before. I typed an answer to that. And the seeding feature works in the way that there is the Prisma DB seed command. And that is just looking for a file that's called seed.ts inside your Prisma directory or just next to your Prisma schema, wherever that's located. And inside the seed file, you can just use Prisma client to populate the database. And I just have a little bit of sample data here, and I can invoke it with the Prisma DB seed command. I have to append the preview feature option. The seeding is still in preview, and it's executing the script. It created 3 users. In fact, if we quickly want to take a look at Prisma Studio again, we'll just quickly see the data that has been created. So again, 3 users, a couple of more posts this time. Yeah, so we have some sample data that we can play around with. So let's go ahead and take a look at the tasks. You can find the task for this lesson inside the index.ts file. They're marked with a to-do comment. Your goal is to insert the right Prisma client queries for each REST API route. Note that this is not a lesson in API design, and in real-world applications, you probably want to think a bit more carefully than I did about how you're naming your operations, how you're structuring them. This is really just for you to get an understanding how kind of Express and Prisma client are playing together. So don't mind the maybe somewhat inconsistent API design here. If you're using VS Code, then you can install the REST client extension and test your implementation using the provided HTTP calls in test.htp. So I prepared this file for you with some test HTTP calls that you can send directly through VS Code by clicking this little button here. I'll show you in a bit. And then the goal is just to go through all of these routes and find the right Prisma client queries for them. The app itself, the API itself, though, it is already runnable. So again, using the command npm run dev, it's starting my server. But since none of these route controllers are actually implemented, they're all still to do. If I were to send an HTTP request now, so for example, to the users route, doesn't work. I don't know why. If I click on this, and it tells me cannot get. Wait, is that correct? Let me test by just implementing. Maybe I messed something up. This one is fairly straightforward. We remember the users query from before. It fetches all users. So just await prisma.user.findMany, and the result is being sent back to the client. Let's see. If that's not working, then I'm confused. Users, okay, here we go. It does work. And if I click on send request here, then I expect to see the result right here in VS Code. So let me also go and implement the next one, sign up. That's a post request. In fact, I can also just always see what's required here. So this is a post request that goes to the sign up route, and it accepts a name and email in the HTTP body. And the way how I'm going to approach this is again by using Prisma client. I want to create a user. I know what method I have to invoke. I remember how to use the auto completion. And I provide the name and the email. And because I destructured here, I don't have to provide, like this is a different notation for this. You all are probably experienced JavaScript developers. When I got into JavaScript, this notation confused the heck out of me. And it took actually quite a while until like somebody explained to me that this is just like shorthand notation for this. So for anyone who's new to JavaScript and you didn't know this, hopefully this makes your life a little bit easier here. Let's test it. I have to restart the server. I don't have hot reloading enabled in this one, so just have to restart it every time. Send this request, create it in the database. Actually, let's try something. If I resend this request another time, I would expect an error to happen because in the Prisma schema, I declare the email to be unique, but this value hasn't changed if I resend the same request. So let's try and see what happens. Send request, and we already see that there is an error in the terminal. Unique constraint failed on the field's email. So that was expected. We only have this one user with this email in the database. Let's see. This one I'm going to skip, how to create a new post. I think with your knowledge from before, you should be able to achieve this. This one is interesting. This increases, so let me just open the Notion document again. So this route is the put request. It's supposed to increment the views of a post by 1. So the query that I'm using, let's go and see what looks good. Again, just by using the auto completion, prisma.post.update. We have to specify which post we want to update. So the ID is provided via this URL parameter here. And then the data. So I'm following Prisma's auto completion. We want to change the view count But how can I increment it by 1? Well, we have these operations here that we can use for this case. And in this case, of course, the 1 increment operation is good. Actually, this doesn't work. I have to cast the string that's coming in here to a number so that Prisma client accepts it. The TypeScript compiler is really trying to protect me from my own mistakes here. npm run dev, starting the API server, sending this put request. Let me move that here again so that we can actually send it a couple of times. So it did increment it. Let's see what happens if we send a few more. Yes, it's incrementing the view count as expected, as it should. That's great. What else do I want to show you? This one is interesting. This is the fetches the unpublished posts of a specific user. So user/ID/drafts. ID is the user ID in this case. How do we implement that? So we want to return drafts from a user. The way how I'm going to write this query, and there would be actually probably multiple ways how you can write it. You could use include, but in this case, I'm using the Fluent API. I think that's the shortest path to implementing this. So I know that these are supposed to be the drafts by a user that has an ID. So I'll first find the user by its ID, again using the number constructor to cast the ID that has been coming in via the URL params. And what now? So this, of course, only returns a user object. And that's not really what I want. What I want is unpublished posts from that user. And that's where I can use the Fluent API. Fluent API means we can just traverse the relationships of Prisma models fluently. And in this case, I can just add the .posts right here. And if I were now to run this, I can already go ahead and test this. Let's send this one. Send requests. Does it work? Does it not work? What did I mess up? Restarting the server. Did I say, I'm not returning, oops. I'm not returning it to the client. It's this query. Wait. Okay, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Anyways, what I wanted to show you is that this wouldn't yield the expected result anyways, because we're not yet filtering. So what you can do here inside the post, wait, should be, okay. Now it's good that I provided these solutions not only for you, but also for myself to see where I got off the rails. I don't know what's happening. I think that was what I wrote. Let's try if the solution works. Yes, this user doesn't have any drafts. Let's check some users. I think the third one does have drafts. Yes, there is one post here, and it's not yet published. So that was another query. And the search string one is a little bit more complicated. I'll let you figure that out. You'll get some time now again, maybe 10 minutes to work on this distraction free. I'll remove myself from the audio, from the video. You can work on it, and please share in the chat when you are done with it. All right, I am back. Don't worry, you still have a couple of minutes. Nobody in the chat yet indicated that they are done with all of the tasks. So you definitely have a couple of more minutes. There also haven't been any new questions in the Q&A. So I just quickly wanted to go back to some previous questions that have been asked that I responded to directly in the Q&A, but I think a few of them were interesting enough to quickly discuss them on the stream here as well. So for example, there was a question about relations that I wanted to quickly bring up here. Can Prisma identify relationships automatically, whether they are one-to-n, n-to-n, or one-to-one? And the answer is that you have to specify, of course, what kind of relations you want to use, but you can use all of these different relation types with Prisma, of course. And the way how you model them is also just following the same kind of idea that you already had with the one-to-n. With the one-to-n relationship that you have between user and post in the example, in the task that you're doing. And that is when you have a too many relationship, you're just using square brackets to indicate that this is a list, an array. When you don't have a too many relationship, but only a to-one relationship, you just put nothing here. And that way you can create one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many relationships. So for example, we have a many-to-many relationship in this case between post and category. And all we have to do is specify the models like this. The way how that looks like under the hood is actually that Prisma is going to maintain a relation table, join table, or junction table is what they're sometimes called as well. It's just a table that has two foreign keys pointing to post and category, and that's just the standard way, basically, how you model many-to-many relationships in relational databases. And with Prisma, it becomes a lot more intuitive. You don't have to actually worry about maintaining this extra table yourself, but instead you can just model the relation like this in the first place. And then also in the Prisma Client API, of course, you can just directly traverse from post to categories and the other way around, because that's the way how it's configured here in the Prisma schema. You don't have to traverse the category to post table that's actually storing that information under the hood. So I hope that's helpful. All right, so one new question in the Q&A. Are there any tools either made by Prisma or the community that help you generate code for CRUD operations in an API? That's a very interesting question. And the answer is yes, in general, but it depends on what kind of API and what kind of library. So for REST APIs, I am not yet aware of tools that would just generate the express routes. Actually, that's not 100% true. There is a tool that's called application, and that's a little bit higher level, but it effectively does exactly this. So it allows you to instantly generate a REST API or a GraphQL API, actually both, based on a Prisma model. And the way how it works is that you first, when you get started with this, let's see, it's been a while since I've used it, but you have this UI where you can create a new app, basically. And under the hood, what that's generating for you is actually a Nest.js project with Prisma. And this will do exactly that. So you can start configuring your entities, your models. Let me see. It's been a while since I've used it. There are fields. What's that last name? I can add a field. let's add, what's good? Let's add age. I guess this age, let's make it optional. That's going to be an integer number. Let's say people in this app can at most be 100 years old. I guess you could now directly create a GitHub repo for this. Is this saved? I don't know. Well, anyways, what I wanted to show you is that when you click download code, I believe what it should do is it should give me here is the project that it gives me. Maybe rather than doing this. Let's quickly inspect this project. I'm actually curious myself now what exactly it gives me. So this is a Nest.js app. No. This is a Nest.js app. Let's quickly check the dependencies. And as far as I know, this really gives you a REST API for your Prisma models and a GraphQL API, as far as I know. I'm just like really experimenting with this right now. I actually don't know how this works. npm start. Yeah, I don't know. Do I have to run npm install first? But either way, I think this is a really interesting tool application that you should check out if you're interested in a tool that like saves you some boilerplate and gives you an API for your data model kind of out of the box. Then you can check out application. In fact, on the Prisma YouTube channel that I already plugged before, in the What's New in Prisma live streams, in the holiday special episode that we did for Christmas, we had one of the founders of Application as a guest on the live stream, and he gave a demo of the tool. So you might want to go back in time and check out this live streams if you're interested in that. So that's one way how you can generate a REST API. I'm not aware of too many other tools, but what's like in general also really interesting is that a lot of framework authors are coming and building their tools and frameworks on top of Prisma. So actually in this blog post that we published recently, we have a list of these frameworks that are all using Prisma as their default ORM. So it's Redwood, it's Blitz, Keystone, Wasp, and Application. Super interesting tools that just like save you boilerplate or try to solve some specific problem for you to make you more productive. So it's definitely worth checking these out, I think. Hope that helped. Next question before we move on to the next lesson. In Prisma, can we validate our properties like email, telephone, phone number, credit card, and so on in a native way, or custom functions before some insert? In a native way, you could only do that by using Prisma's middleware. So what Prisma has a middleware function that you can invoke on Prisma client that's called use. And I guess in here, like this, the function that you're defining here intercepts every Prisma client query. And that would be a good place where you could perform such a validation. If you want to do it on the database level, then you would have to go and actually use, I guess, check constraints yourself. We have a guide for that that explains you how you can configure these with plain SQL in our documentation as well. So that would then look something like this. Cool. I answered both questions that popped up for the Q&A. So I'm going back now to the Notion document and to my project to continue with the workshop. Last lesson. A couple of you, let me very quickly catch up with the chat. I see that there were a couple of new messages, I think, or actually no, just some people dropped out, that's fine. Let's move on to lesson 4. Lesson 4 actually is very similar to lesson 3, except that you're not going to use a REST API, but a GraphQL API. Actually, very quickly again, just by show of hand, who of you has worked with GraphQL on the server side before? Like no matter which tools you have been using, maybe SDL first, maybe Nexus, maybe Type GraphQL. There are quite a few libraries. Okay, I've seen only 2 hands, 3 hands. 3 people have used GraphQL on the server side. That's okay. You don't have to be super familiar with GraphQL to be able to accomplish the following tasks. So a couple of more people, maybe 6 or 7 people have experience with GraphQL on the server. I'll very quickly explain the most important concepts for you so that you have an overview of what you need to do, what it even means to implement a GraphQL resolver. But before that, I'm going through the same kind of dance to reset my project. I'm stashing all the changes. I'm switching the branch. I'm resetting my database, deleting the migration history, deleting and reinstalling node modules. And again, we'll start by looking at the package JSON file, understanding the new structure of this project. So we recognize a number of dependencies from before. We have Prisma, we have the TypeScript setup, we have Prisma client. In addition to that, this time we have GraphQL and Apollo server. So we'll be using Apollo server for this workshop, but really you could use Express GraphQL, Mercurius. Prisma doesn't care what kind of stack you're using on the backend. Data model, again, is the same as in the REST API example. We're creating the database, we're seeding the database, and that's it. We're ready for our tasks. Maybe not all of you might have used GraphQL on the back end, but maybe have you used GraphQL on the front end? So who has used GraphQL on the front end? Go ahead and raise your hand. Let's see how many people. I recognize the same names from before. I'm not sure if there are a lot more. Either way, let me very quickly then give you an overview of what GraphQL actually is. GraphQL is sort of similar to REST. It's an API technology that allows you to expose API operations via HTTP to your client applications, whether that are web applications, mobile applications, or even other web servers that need to access your API for some reason. And with every GraphQL API, you have 2 components. You have the schema and you have resolvers. And the schema we actually see right here. And I mentioned before that Prisma's modeling language has been inspired by GraphQL's modeling language. And I think you can somewhat recognize what I meant with that, because the keywords are a little bit different. The formatting, some kind of like minor syntax pieces are different, but overall it looks fairly similar. And I think both are intuitive enough that you can just read them and understand what's going on. And in this case, even the API operations that we define via GraphQL right here, they mirror pretty much the same operations that we exposed via REST API routes in the previous lesson. So for example, we have a query that's called all users. But instead of needing to go to another URL, so now I don't have to do this in order to actually invoke that operation on the server and get this data. But instead, I just go to a single URL that's exposed by the GraphQL server, and I can start writing my queries here. And these queries are then sent via a post request to the GraphQL server, and it'll respond with some data or not. As in this case, when I'm running this, we get an error. And the reason for that is that these API operations, they are not yet implemented. Again, you have a number of to-do comments right here, where it's your task to now go ahead and return the right data from these queries. So let me quickly show you how to, for example, return the data for the all users query right here. In this case, the Prisma client instance, it's actually attached to what's called the context in GraphQL. The context is just a means for the GraphQL resolvers, all of these functions here, to communicate with each other. And it's just good practice to put anything that's needed by all resolvers into the context object and then access it from there. But as you can see, you get the same auto-completion on Prisma client right here. And here I want to return all users. So I'm just going ahead and say return prisma.user.findMany and restart the server. And let's see what happens if I resend the same query from before. Well, we receive the data that we seeded before in the database. In fact, the cool thing about GraphQL now is that I can change what I want to have returned by the query. So if I remove fields here, then these fields will also be removed from the response. And if I add them back, then they will come back. It's kind of similar to the select API in Prisma client, right? And another cool thing now with GraphQL is that I can also query relations. So what you would do with the include API of Prisma client. And again, I can select what properties I want to have returned here. But in this case, all of them will just get an empty array because we haven't implemented the corresponding resolver. Now, one way to resolve this could be to say, well, if I want to include the relation to posts, I already know how this is done. I could solve this by including the posts right here. And that's going to work, or it should work if I'm not mistaken. So if I now query this, this user's query returns the post. So it doesn't work, and that's actually good because the actual resolver that I want to explain in just a bit is overriding this. But if I were to comment it out, then I would expect this to work and return the data. Yeah. So that's one way of resolving this problem using include here, but that's actually not considered good practice in GraphQL, because in GraphQL, you have this nested resolver system that can resolve these relations for you. So rather than on the root resolver level, this all users resolver is a root resolver. It's on the top of a query. I need to implement a type resolver on a type level. And in this case, I need to implement the post resolver on the user type. And the way how to implement that is, again, very similar to what we did before. In this case, I need to find the user that's being queried and then return their posts. And the way how to do that is by using the parent argument that's being passed into a resolver, by using find unique, where by ID. And now I'm using the parent argument that's carrying the ID. And finally, I can return the posts right here. And now with the magic of the GraphQL resolver system, if I restart the server and I query this, we get exactly the same behavior. And I can even again, just say what exactly I want to have returned from the GraphQL server in this case. You can do the same for post. So the pattern for these type resolvers with Prisma is actually always very similar. In this case, I just need to go ahead, change this to post, and change the relation field to author here. And that's all I have to do. And in fact, this now works recursively. So restarting the server. If I now wanted to include again on each post the author, I can do that. And on each author, again, the posts, that's also possible. So that way you can write these deeply nested queries that are just resolved by the type resolvers right here. Let me just implement a couple of more operations, but in fact, you'll notice that the operations are very similar to what you saw before. So post by ID, you implemented a similar one in the REST API lesson. I need to find a post by its ID. The ID is provided via the args. So it's args.id. And drafts by user, for example, is also return context.prisma.user. Find unique where ID args.id and posts. And I can apply the same filter from before, published false. Format, restart. I can send a query in a new tab, drafts by user. I think user with ID 3 had one. Title published, and there you go. We have the same post that we seeded before. All right. That was a crash course in GraphQL. Also, very quickly before I let you get to work on this, coming back very quickly to the question about CRUD API, CRUD APIs being generated for Prisma models. It depends on which GraphQL libraries you want to use, whether that's possible or not. In this case, we're using the so-called SDL first approach. That means we're writing our GraphQL schema out as a string, and then we're implementing this so-called resolver map, and then we're passing both of these to the Apollo server that is then matching the resolvers to the schema. So it's very important actually when you follow this approach that the way how you write your schema and the way how you write your resolvers, you don't have any typos. They have to match one-to-one so that Apollo server can map them to each other under the hood. But there are other approaches to building your GraphQL schema with Apollo server. Two ones that I want to mention here are Nexus and Type GraphQL. And with these libraries, there are integrations to Prisma that allow you to rather quickly generate GraphQL CRUD APIs for your Prisma models. In fact, we have a Type GraphQL CRUD blog post and also a ready-to-run example that I'm going to drop in the chat. If you're interested in that, if you really just super quickly want to see how you can spin up a GraphQL API that you still have control over. You're still controlling the GraphQL server. You're still in control of the actual operations. Then I would recommend you to check out the article and this example right here. Okay, let's again have you work on implementing these resolvers yourself. Again, I'll remove myself from audio and video. I'll give you like roughly 10 minutes to do that, and then we'll wrap up the stream. So if you have any questions, now is also the time to put them into Q&A so that I can pick them up afterwards. And I'll get you to work and remove myself. All right, we are back, and I'm going to slowly wrap up. We have 18 people still in the workshop. I'm very impressed by the grit that you all have been showing today, that you stuck with me until the end almost here. Very nice. I'm very happy that you all participated. All right. I'm going to pick a couple of more questions that have been raised in the Q&A section, and then it's time to wrap up this workshop for today. So first question, any plans to add the ability to enforce database constraints at the Prisma schema level? So that's the same topic that we talked about before. The question of how to do validation in Prisma, basically, how to validate the data before it gets inserted into the database. Actually, I would guess that there is probably an open issue for that. Let me just check if I can find one or find the right one. Unset. Add check constraints via Prisma migrate and surface them on Prisma client. So here is an idea for actually like natively enabling check constraints in the Prisma schema. So I'll drop the link to this issue in the chat. The question came from Calvin. So Calvin, if you're interested in this feature, then please leave your thumbs up and ideally a comment in this GitHub issue. As I mentioned before, this helps us prioritize when we see that people are interested in this. Next question, what is the ecosystem around Prisma? Some services where we can deploy our backend in Prisma and database, put it in the portfolio tools that help to improve the experience with Prisma, or another thing, communities, web handler, Twitter accounts, books, etc. There is a lot, actually, and I'm going to start by pointing you to our community page. I think that's a great place to just get an overview of different things that exist. So one thing that I want to highlight is that we are regularly hosting various meetups. For example, we host the Berlin and the TypeScript and GraphQL Berlin meetups groups that typically happen in our office in Berlin. But due to the current situation, of course, at the moment, they're all happening online. So you're all invited to join us there. There are more resources that you can find from here. I know that somebody's also currently working on a book. It's a Jamstack book with Prisma. There is a course on Udemy about Prisma, where once a month we release a free code so that you can take it for free. So I think typically it's around like actually $80 at the moment, but like once a month we're releasing a code so that you can take this course for free. And the best way to get this code is by watching our What's New in Prisma live streams on the YouTube channel. So I'll definitely also recommend that you join us with these live streams in the future to learn what's new in the Prisma ecosystem. And of course, Prisma is also on Twitter. So if you just check for at Prisma there, that's our account. You can follow it. And that's probably also the best way how you can always get the latest news. In Prisma, can we test our project? So testing is a very interesting question, and one that's actually not only relevant to Prisma itself. It's just like a general question of how to test with Prisma. We are working on more in-depth resources. In fact, I think that there is even a PR in our docs repo that my colleague Rich is working on. Testing guide. So we'll add some more resources about testing with Prisma very, very soon. For the time being, we have these docs, and there's also this this guide by one of our community members that you can check out. That also should give you a good overview on testing workflows with Prisma. Next question. In Prisma, do we need to install dependencies like add types /Prisma, or is it not necessary? I think after these lessons, it hopefully became clear that it's indeed not necessary. All you need is to install the @Prisma /client dependency. In fact, this gets installed automatically for you when you run a Prisma migrate command, and Prisma client is generated for you under the hood. So all of this is happening automatically, and you don't have to worry about that yourself. Next question from Nick. When doing nested GraphQL queries, does Prisma do any optimization before making the SQL queries, like batching them together, or they just execute it one by one? That's a great question, and one that I'm happy to answer with yes. Prisma does do optimizations for you. We also have documentation for that. Query optimization, it's explained here. So Prisma Client has a built-in data loader. The data loader is the tool that is being used in GraphQL. If you were not using Prisma, then you would have to implement this data loader yourself in the resolvers. But when you're using Prisma, you're getting these optimizations out of the box. And you can learn about this in the documentation on the docs page that I showed you here. I'm dropping the link in the chat so you can find it later. Hope that Joshua, in the search string query, is it possible to type the OR constant, or is that IntelliSense will work with the field names? You can type the OR constant. In fact, we're doing that in our examples. I was lazy. We have this Prisma examples repo, and the examples that you'll find for REST Express and GraphQL SDL first are actually the ones that I've based this workshop on. So if I understand your question correctly, then what you wanted to do is this. You want to type the OR constant. And yeah, here's how you can do it. You can just access the generated Prisma post where input type via the Prisma namespace, and then this is typed. Next question, final question. Almost final question by Yannick. Any plans on adding model events to Prisma on create, on delete, or are middlewares what should be used for that? Use case soft deletes. That's also a really, really good question. Let me just close some tabs here. I am a person that likes to have as few tabs as possible. Soft deletes. In fact, yes, if you want to do soft deletes with Prisma today, then the best way to do that is via middleware. In fact, we have this guide here that explains how to do that. So if you're interested in that, you can read up the docs on that here. We do plan to eventually add like support for actual real-time kind of subscription-like functionality to Prisma Client as well, where you can subscribe to database events, most likely with the change data capture pattern. But this is still like fairly far down the road, I would say. So what you can always do in these kinds of cases, you can go to GitHub, check if we already have a GitHub issue, leave your thumbs up, leave a comment, tell us how much you want this. And eventually this feature is going to end up on our roadmap where you can track the stuff that we are currently working on or that we're going to work on soon. Right now, this kind of real-time API is not part of the roadmap. But eventually, I think this is something that we'll want to add to Prisma Client. Last question, performance with Prisma. Can we load a big amount of data in our database? 1,000 records, 5,000 records. I guess that should be possible. As I mentioned before, I haven't heard of many people that had performance problems with Prisma Client. And as I mentioned, if they do, then they create GitHub issues and we help them resolve these issues. So I would say just go ahead and try. And if you run into any problems, then we're there for you on GitHub. All right, that was the last question. That was the end of a long day for me. No matter where you are, I hope that you enjoyed this workshop with me. I hope to see you around in our community, on our Slack, on GitHub, on Twitter. And with that, I'm going to let you all go and hope to see you around. Bye, everybody.